Once upon a time, Christianity was illegal and regarded as a threat to society and to traditional family values. The empire tried to stamp it out by force, but the more they persecuted it, the more it grew. And then one day the empire changed tack. Instead of persecuting the Christian church, the empire adopted it as its own. Whether this was a sincere decision or a calculating and strategic one, we'll never know for sure. But adopting Christianity into the empire neutered it far more effectively than persecution ever had. What it did most effectively, and is still doing fairly effectively today, was to collapse people's images of what it means to be a good Christian into their images of what it means to be a good citizen of the society. You see this at its most glaringly obvious in the idea that patriotism or nationalism is a Christian duty. For example, Scott Morrison was the most overtly church-going Christian prime minister we've had in a long time. And yet this collapsing of Christianity into patriotic duty enabled him to still advocate horrific, inhumane treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. Because in this view, neighbours are those we live alongside, inside our national borders, and so the call to love our neighbours isn't seen to conflict with rejecting and mistreating outsiders. So we end up with the common misconception that all good law-abiding citizens are more or less good Christians, unless they identify with some other religion, in which case, so long as they're still law-abiding and friendly, we'll grant that they are good Muslims or good Buddhists or whatever. Empire can adopt any religion and every religion so long as it can be collapsed into loyalty to the nation, obedience to the laws, and friendly relations with one's neighbours. And thus, even in Australia, where very few people regularly attend church, it's still quite common to hear descriptions like, oh, he's a really good bloke, devoted to his wife and kids, loves his neighbour, a real Christian. Whereas in fact, if there were no such thing as Christianity, this bloke's behaviour would be no different at all. It would just be described as good citizenship. A generalised niceness that doesn't make trouble for your neighbours or disturb the peace. The words we heard from Jesus tonight are actually quite scathing about this. What's so special about that, Jesus asks. Anyone can love those who love them and treat them well. Anyone can do good to those who like them and are good to them. Just watch how generously Donald Trump rewards those who display their love of him. So Jesus ups the ante big time. He calls his followers to a love that is on a whole new level, a love that seems to most people to be a threat to society and to traditional patriotic and family values. Love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Now, when we hear those words, more often than not, we just focus on the first phrase, love your enemies. And we either imagine that we don't really have any enemies, or we imagine that these words refer to some generalized enemies out there somewhere, people who live in another country and who hate who we are. And we can kind of imagine that we're loving them, but we actually never have to deal with them in any way at all. So our love never really has to be put into practice. But Jesus does not let us get off that lightly. He's talking about something much more real and much more immediate, much more challenging. When people treat you, yes, you, hatefully, return nothing but good. Love them. When people curse you and insult you and spread nasty gossip about you, return nothing but blessings. Love them. When people abuse you and betray you and rip you off, pray that God will bless them. Love them. There is absolutely nothing normal about that kind of love. Most normal people regard it as absurd and unthinkable. as a threat to social stability. And there's nothing easy about this kind of love. In my own experience, it's incredibly difficult, especially when I've been hurt badly or my loved ones have been hurt badly. I've had times and situations where I have found it excruciatingly difficult to let go of some serious anger and resentments. As some of you will remember, some years ago, I was involved in an unsuccessful struggle against the plan to close down and sell off the University Residential College part of our Baptist college, Whitley College. Most of my struggle was to try and get those involved to publicly reveal and explain the reasons for the intended closure. Because not only was that residential ministry being sacrificed, but it certainly wasn't obvious that there would be any benefit for the theological college. 8 years later, there still doesn't appear to be any benefit to anyone except the lawyers. Looking back, I can see that at times during that struggle, I was an obnoxious smartass, and I tried to embarrass people into doing what they should have been doing. And it's probably true that they thoroughly deserved it, but that doesn't justify my behavior. But it's also true that my behavior didn't justify theirs. They had a much bigger constituency that they owed answers to, and they hid behind closed doors and concealed everything from everyone. And by the end, I was pretty bitter and twisted. That residential college had been a significant ministry belonging to all our churches. And it was also a ministry that my wife had poured out the last 12 years of her life into leading. And as far as I can tell, its closure was an act of sheer vandalism, aided and abetted by utter negligence. And a number of the key people involved were people I had respected, admired, and counted as close friends and allies. But by the end, I felt utterly betrayed and shat all over by them. I still do. What do I do with such a large burden of pain and anger and resentment? Back at the time, I sat with that question when I went on retreat in the Western Australian desert about a year after the events. I did not feel at all ready or able to love my enemies, to do good to those who brushed me aside or threatened me, to bless those who denounced me or criticized me, to pray for those who had trashed everything that Margie had spent those years building up. I wanted them held to account. I wanted them made to pay. I wanted retribution. I wanted to be vindicated. And actually, I still think that all those feelings are justified. In an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth world, that would be what should happen. But justified and ultimately desirable are not the same thing. I don't want to live in a perfectly eye for an eye world because I'd very soon be blind. And Jesus calls me to let go of my thirst for retribution and instead to love my enemies. But why? And what does all this mean? Is Jesus just taking an old law and replacing it with an even harder law, a virtually impossible law? Is this just a new set of rules that we can all fail at and feel guilty about? Because if that's what it's about, then Jesus is not doing us any favors. That's not good news. That's making things worse. But as I wrestled with this in the desert, I began to see the wisdom and the liberating power of what Jesus is saying. I've preached this before, but knowing how to live it was another matter. There's a difference between knowing it in my head to talk about it and knowing it deep in my gut and finding a way to inhabit it in the context of my own personal hurts and resentments. The first thing that I began to face up to at that time was that the fight was over. Even if I kept fighting for people to be brought to account, not only would I probably continue to fail, but it couldn't bring the college back. It had already been sold and the bulldozers had gone in and torn it down. It was over. Not just in that case, but in so many situations. No amount of retribution can change the past or undo the damage. It's done. It's over. And if my resentment continues to fester, the only person who's really burned by my resentment is me. Those perpetrators got off scot-free, and poisoning myself with bitterness is not going to hurt them, only me. As Martin Luther King said, hate is a cancer that gnaws away at the very vital center of your life and your existence. It is like an eroding acid that eats away the best and the objective center of your life. So Jesus says love, because hate destroys the hater as well as the hated. Or as Anne Lamott put it, withholding forgiveness and clinging to resentment is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die. So I saw something of what my resentment was doing to me, and I heard the call to lay it down. I was clinging to it almost as a defining part of my identity, but it was poisoning me. I had to lay it down so I could live. I can't pretend that I left all that behind in the desert 6 years ago. It wells up again from time to time, and I have to keep on steeling myself and laying it down again. But that was only the beginning of what I had to wrestle with over this out there in the desert at that time. I also began to see deep in my own heart how allowing these people to make me resentful and bitter and twisted actually hands them control of my life, of the kind of person I become. If I let myself feel driven to retaliate every time I am attacked or insulted or disregarded, then all my enemies need to do to turn me into a nasty, violent, and hateful person is treat me in nasty, violent, hateful ways, and then I'll do the rest of the job for them. I'm allowing them to define me, to determine who and what I become. I'm handing them the keys to my life. I think it was Martin Luther King Jr. again, or maybe Mahatma Gandhi, or possibly both, who said, I pray that nothing they ever do to me will be able to reduce me to hating them. The logic of this is as simple as it is daunting. If I say I want to become a loving and merciful person like Jesus, am I going to follow through on that goal only on the condition that everyone around me cooperates and makes it easy for me by being consistently lovable and nice to me? Or am I going to have the strength and resolve to forge ahead and follow in the footsteps of Jesus by developing an extravagant and indomitable love and mercy that can stay the course even if I am betrayed and humiliated and falsely accused and rejected and crucified? Will I allow other people's failures and falsehoods to map out my course? Or will I break free of the tit-for-tat retribution game and take my cues from Jesus, regardless of the actions of others? And you know what? Here's the thing. The point where this goes way beyond being a tough personal challenge and becomes really, really good news for all of us together is that this is actually about a whole new culture that is grounded in who God is, in what God is like. This is not just about a personal challenge to become more loving, but it is about what kind of world we want to live in, what kind of culture we are building and shaping as we follow Jesus together. Jesus says that if we quit the tit for tat and love our enemies, we will be children of the Most High. For God is kind, extravagantly kind, even to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, he says, just as God is merciful. The choice is laid before me and before each one of us. Every one of us has been lied to. abused, dismissed, ripped off, disrespected. And we are perfectly justified in becoming the mirror image of that if we so choose. But we have also been recklessly and extravagantly loved and showered in generous mercy, not by our neighbors perhaps, but by God. And the pathway of freedom and new life is to turn down the call to hate others as they have hated us, and to instead choose to follow the call to love our neighbors as we have been loved by God. And that is the key to the life we all yearn to live. We long to live in a world that is not just an echo chamber of reciprocal hatreds, a world that is not shaped or manipulated by trolls and haters. We long to live in a world full of love and mercy that can't be defeated, that can't be shouted down, that can't be poisoned by bitterness. That world does exist. It is the kingdom of God, the culture of God. We can't even see it as long as we cling to our resentments, because we simply can't open ourselves to a love that we're not willing to see poured out, lest it spill over to those we would like to see excluded from it. But whether we see it or not, it is there, calling to us, inviting us to let go of our pain and come on in. It is there, fairly buzzing with the reckless generosity and mercy of the Most High, who pours out loving kindness on absolutely everyone, even the undeserving, the ungrateful, and the wicked. But it is there. It is there, a culture of wild, liberating love, where all are set free to love more and more and more, and not even the most vile haters can stop them. Don't fall for the defeatist false teaching that says these words from Jesus are not really for now, but are just a utopian dream of a future heaven. Jesus came proclaiming that the culture of God has drawn near, is even now at hand. God's culture of reckless forgiveness and overflowing, unstoppable love is right here, calling us to get on board. It's not exactly free. In the desert, I saw what it was going to cost me, and I suspect it's much the same for most of us. It is going to cost us our cherished resentments, our hostilities, our enmities. But what a bargain. Take the money, let me in. When once we taste the love of God broken open and poured out for us at the Lord's table, why would we settle for the moldy crumbs of what we've carried for so long? Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Not because they deserve it, not because you like them or the way they've behaved, but because you will no longer allow them to drag you away from the joyous party that is the culture of God, where love conquers all and sets us free to grow into all the love we were created and destined for.